case today centers around McMartin Preschool, which was located in Manhattan Beach, California. On the 12th of August 1983, Judy Johnson called police to report that her 2.5-year-old son Billy had been sexually molested by a member of staff at the school, 25-year-old Ray Buckey. Judy Johnson would make a number of elaborate allegations against Ray Buckey to police, causing them to send letters to 200 parents, asking them to speak to their children to see if they too had been victimized at McMartin. Children were then sent to the Children's Institute International, where they were interviewed at length to determine whether they too had been the victims of child sexual abuse. With the dramatic increase in the number of children reported to have been abused, this case would become a media sensation. At its peak, authorities announced that 7 McMartin teachers had committed 397 sexual crimes, in addition to the 115 for which they had already been charged. This case would take its toll in so many ways. For example, financially, it would cost the state $15 million at its conclusion. But more importantly, it would take a huge emotional toll, as children, their parents, and members of staff from McMartin would be forced to take the witness stand to testify. Hi everyone, it's Emily from the Student's Verdict podcast. Thank you so much for joining me for another episode. I'm going to warn you now, go get yourself a beer, a wine, a gin, whatever you fancy, because this is going to be a long one. If you haven't already, please go and listen to some of our earlier episodes, which include cases such as that of Ronald Sanford, a man who was sentenced to 170 years in prison for a crime he committed when he was just 13 years old, and our newest episode on vigilantes. Just going to run through some of our social media. So we can be found on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, YouTube. On Instagram, our handle is @TheStudentVerdictBlog, and on Twitter, it's @StudentVerdict. Resources used in this episode will always be linked in the show notes, so please make sure to go and check those out. If you enjoy the show, please give us a star rating and a review. If you don't enjoy it, please don't tell me. A quick trigger/content warning for this episode. As I've said, it's going to be a long one, but because of the nature of the allegations, it may not be appropriate for all listeners. We are going to be discussing child abuse, so therefore listener discretion is advised. Now, before we start, as I've said, I've really gone down the rabbit hole with this case. I've spent hours and hours researching. My primary source of research for this case was from famous-trials.com. So if you want to look at the material yourself, that's where you need to go. With all of that said, let's jump into today's episode. As I've said, today's case centers around McMartin Preschool, which was founded in 1956 by Virginia McMartin. This preschool quickly garnered a very good reputation, and parents were desperate to send their children there. In fact, in 1977, Virginia won the Rose and Scroll Award, which was the city's highest honor. Staff at the school, it was kind of a family affair, so staff at the school included Peggy Buckey, Virginia's daughter, and Ray Buckey, Virginia's grandson. The 7-year case started with an allegation made by the mother of a child who attended McMartin Preschool. Judy Johnson had a son who was 2.5 years old. His name was Billy. He started to attend McMartin Preschool in May 1983. He went approximately 10 times before the 12th of August 1983, and this was the day that Judy Johnson called police to report that her son had been sexually abused by a member of teaching staff at the preschool. She identified her son's abuser as 25-year-old Ray Buckey. Judy reported to detectives that a spot of blood was discovered on her son's anus after a day at preschool. On the 18th of August 1983, Judy met with Detective Hogue to discuss her complaint further. On the 30th of August of the same year, she would take her son Billy with her to meet with detectives. During this meeting, Billy alleged that he had indeed been abused by Ray Buckey. In a summary of the Deputy DA's meeting with Judy Johnson in 1985, 2 years after her initial allegation, Judy made what I can only describe as some extraordinary claims. She told authorities that her son Billy had told her he had been at communion in a church where a prayer similar to that of the Lord's Prayer was recited. During the ritual, a baby, which Billy said was real, had its head chopped off and the brains burned. Billy recalled that it was Peggy Buckey who had killed the baby. Judy told authorities that her son was made to drink the baby's blood. Billy described 3 teachers at the school dressing as witches. He said that they buried him in a coffin without holes in it. On another occasion, he recalled being on a train. He alleged that staples were put in his ears, nipples, and tongue. He alleged that Babs, one of the teachers at McMartin, had put scissors in his eyes, hit him a lot, and threw him against a wall. She even made threats to kidnap him. Judy Johnson would allege that Ray Buckey sodomized her son whilst her son's head was in a toilet. Despite the fact that Billy was unable to identify Ray Buckey from photos and the lack of injuries to the boy, Ray Buckey was arrested on the 7th of September 1983. The following day, on the 8th of September, Police Chief Harry Kuhlmeier made the decision to send a letter to approximately 200 McMartin preschool parents to determine whether there were any further victims. In this letter, parents were informed that Ray Buckey was suspected of child abuse. The letter in part read, "Records indicate that your child has been or is currently a student at the preschool. We are asking your assistance in this continuing investigation. Please question your child to see if he or she has been a witness to any crime or if he or she has been a victim. Our investigation indicates that possible criminal acts include oral sex, fondling of genitals, buttocks, or chest area, and sodomy, possibly committed under the pretense of taking the child's temperature. Also, photos may have been taken of children without their clothing. Any information from your child regarding having ever observed Ray Buckey to leave a classroom alone with a child during any nap period, or if they have ever observed Ray Buckey tie up a child, is important." The letter concluded with Chief Kuhlmeier's request that parents keep the investigation confidential because of, quote, "the nature of the charges and the highly emotional effect it could have on our community." He therefore requested that the investigation not be discussed outside of individual families. I'm not sure what Chief Kuhlmeier was expecting, but I think it's very unsurprising when I say that the news of Ray Buckey's arrest spread like wildfire throughout the community, and almost everyone in the area knew of the ongoing police investigation. Now the whole world and his wife knows about this ongoing investigation. McMartin parents demanded a full-scale investigation. More supposed victims came forward in response to the police letter. And as the pool of potential victims grew, police felt that they needed to call in experts. And by experts, I mean the Children's Institute International, or CII, whose mission it was to identify and treat abused children. The interviews at the CII would be led by a consultant called Key McFarlane. Investigators encouraged parents to take their children to Key McFarlane at the CII to be interviewed. Approximately 400 children were interviewed in relation to the McMartin abuse scandal, and by March 1984, 384 former McMartin students had been diagnosed as having been sexually abused. In addition to the interviews, 150 children received medical examinations from Dr. Astrid Hager, also from CII. Dr. Hager concluded that 80% of the children she examined had indeed been molested. She largely based her findings on the child's medical history rather than physical evidence. She believed that any conclusion should validate the history of the child. It is said that her initial examinations revealed physical evidence of sexual assault in only 6 cases, and it couldn't be definitively proven that this abuse occurred at McMartin. According to Dr. Hager, the evidence of sexual assault appeared as small scarring patterns in the genital and rectal areas of the children. In 1984, the investigation would heat up. On the 13th of January 1984, Virginia McMartin and Peggy Buckey permanently closed the McMartin Preschool 28 years after the institution was established. The McMartin abuse scandal became a huge media sensation after Wayne Satz of KABC News reported previously unknown details of the investigation. It was said that this was the same Wayne Satz who was dating CII consultant Key McFarlane. On the 24th of February 1984, 2 McMartin parents, the Currys, sued Virginia McMartin, Peggy Buckey, and Ray Buckey for assault and battery and intentional infliction of emotional distress. They were seeking $1 million in punitive damages. The increased awareness of the McMartin abuse scandal had wider ramifications for not only the parents, children, and staff of McMartin, but for daycare centers in general. A number of institutions in the LA area were raided and searched by authorities as part of the ongoing investigation, but no incriminating evidence was found. On the 22nd of March 1984, 7 defendants, including Virginia McMartin, Peggy Buckey, her 2 children Ray and Peggy Ann Buckey, Mary Ann Jackson, Bette Rader, and Babette Spittler, were indicted on 115 counts of child sexual abuse. By May 1984, the indictment would be altered to reflect 208 counts involving 40 alleged victims. The LA Times reported that the victims had been subject to fondling and rape and had been forced to witness animals being slaughtered. Here are some other important dates for you. So on the 12th of April 1984, the CII launched its campaign for public donations to help fund the cost of the McMartin case, and by 1989, they had accumulated $11 million in government grants. As I've explained before, by the 8th of August 1984, prosecutor Lael Rubin announced that the 7 McMartin teachers had actually committed 397 sexual crimes, in addition to the original 115 charges. On the 6th of March 1985, Judy Johnson, the original complainant, was hospitalized following a psychotic episode. Prior to the commencement of the preliminary hearing, prosecutor Lael Rubin was telling news reporters the defendants in the McMartin case had committed 397 sexual crimes and that 30 individuals associated with the McMartin preschool were currently under investigation. During the course of the police investigation, various premises were searched, including the school and the homes of faculty members, but nothing of substance has ever been found. Parents of McMartin students conducted their own investigations by digging up areas of the school grounds, having been told there were secret rooms where some of the abuse took place. Again, they uncovered nothing, and neither did the archaeological team hired by the district attorney. The preliminary hearing began in August 1984 and was heard before Municipal Court Judge Aviva Bob. It's been described as one of the longest and strangest preliminary hearings. This hearing involved 7 defendants, each one with their own attorney, and 3 prosecutors. The purpose of a preliminary hearing is to determine whether the allegations have merit and whether there is enough evidence to require a trial. The prosecutor therefore tends to drive these hearings. However, during the McMartin preliminary hearing, the defense didn't sit quietly. They were aggressive in their cross-examination of prosecution witnesses, which included allegedly abused children, their parents, therapists, and medical experts. The defense aim was to undermine the evidence, questioning how such abuse had gone undetected, supposedly for years. During the preliminary hearing, the prosecution witness, Kee McFarlane, took the stand. She attempted to answer the defense's questions, explaining that children can remain silent for two reasons, either because they suffered from denial syndrome or because threats had been made against victims and their families if the child was to come forward. McFarlane talked of being able to bring out the children's accounts through the use of dolls and puppets. We'll be returning to the dolls and puppets later. One of the key issues raised in the preliminary hearing were the interviewing techniques adopted by staff at the CII. When the defense viewed videotapes of the interviews with the children, they were hugely critical of the therapists' leading questions and subtle pressure. They believed that the therapists were attempting to get all of the children's stories to align to support the prosecution's case. During the hearing, the defense highlighted inconsistencies and contradictions in the testimony of the children. Some children testified that photographs had been taken of them when they were nude as part of the naked movie star game. The line they said was, "What you see is what you are. You're a naked movie star." Other children talked about a nude game of cowboys and Indians. Sexual assaults would take place during this game. The list of places where sexual assaults took place included car washes, storerooms, farms, and a secret room accessible by previously mentioned tunnels. The children testified that animals were sacrificed, and one boy even testified that the children had been made to drink the blood of sacrificed animals. Another boy testified that he had seen the McMartin teachers dig up coffins in a cemetery and hack at the bodies contained within with knives. It would seem that by September 1985, a year into the preliminary hearing, some members of the prosecution team had begun to doubt the strength of their own case. One prosecutor said, quote, "Kee McFarlane could make a 6-month-old baby say he was molested." The suggestion was made that the charges be dropped against all but 2 of the defendants, Ray and Peggy Buckey. Despite Chief Prosecutor Lael Rubin's belief that all 7 deserved prosecution, by December 1985, the DA's office had decided to drop the charges against 5 of the 7 defendants, meaning they would only proceed with the prosecutions of Ray and Peggy Buckey. Peggy Buckey faced 20 counts and Ray Buckey faced 79 counts of child sexual abuse. So far, this case had cost the LA County $4 million, and that's before the trial had even begun. Regarding the 5 defendants who had had the charges dropped against them, you might think that they were elated, and maybe they were, but you also have to think about the other side of the coin. Allegations of an extremely serious nature, possibly the most serious nature, had been made against them, and everyone in their community and beyond knew about it. Rather than being able to have a trial, which would have afforded them the opportunity to give their account in open court, the charges were simply dropped behind closed doors. That's not the same as being found not guilty, meaning that the damage that was done wouldn't be undone, as there would always be people in the community who believed they were guilty, but that there was just insufficient evidence to prove it. Now, before we get into the nitty-gritty with the trial and opening statements, here is a quick trailer for a really amazing podcast, the podcast From the Crypt. Please give them a listen, leave them a review. It really does make all the difference. And why not follow them on social media as well?
I'm Devin.
And I'm Steph.
And we are the Podcast from the Crypt.
Join us every Friday as we discuss accounts of murder, mayhem, paranormal, and all things spooky.
Plus a dash of comedy to help soothe your soul during these chilling tales.
You can find us anywhere you listen to your favorite podcasts. Spotify, Stitcher, Apple Podcasts, etc.
Also, you can find us at thepodcastfromthecrypt.buzzsprout.com, and you can choose from there how you'd like to listen.
You can find us on Instagram and Facebook, both at The Podcast from the Crypt.
Be sure to tune in and listen to us discuss what nightmares are made of.
Let's get weird.
And as always, hail Satan.
And we'll see you in hell.
In December 1986, prior to the start of the trial, the catalyst for this whole case, the first complainant, Judy Johnson, died of alcohol poisoning before she could testify in court. It was said that before her death, she'd actually indicated an unwillingness to testify in any event. It was found in January 1987 that the prosecution had withheld important exculpatory evidence relating to the mental well-being of Judy Johnson. I'm not sure how truthful it is, but I have seen during my research that Judy Johnson may have been suffering with schizophrenia. The trial would nevertheless commence with opening statements in January 1987. In her opening statement to the court, the Deputy District Attorney, Lael Rubin, described the case as being about trust. She explained to the jury that innocent children had put their trust in their teachers and that the teachers had betrayed them. Dean Gitz, defense counsel for Peggy Bucky, told the jury that his client was not perfect. She talked too much and was nosy, but that she had a warm and kind heart. He went on to say, quote, "The people interviewed 450 children and 150 adults. Also, 49 photo lineups were prepared. Bank account records were seized and examined. 82 locations were photographed. 1 church was investigated. 3 churches were implicated. 2 food markets, 2 car washes, 2 airports, and 1 national park. Thousands of pornographic photographs and movies confiscated by police were examined in a search for pictures of the McMartin children. Laboratory tests were conducted on 20 blankets from the school, children's clothing, sheets, rags, and a long list of other items including mops, kitchen rags, notebooks, soil samples, sponges, animal bones, quilts, underwear, and an archaeological dig was conducted. All of these investigations came up negative. They were looking for secret tunnels and trapdoors. They conducted surveillance of Ray Bucky, his family and friends, which consumed 135 hours. They consulted with a satanic expert, US customs agents. They contacted pedophiles. They checked real estate records, utilities records, relatives, friends, associates of the Bucky family, other possible offenders, vehicles, uncharged suspects. He concluded his opening statement by saying, quote, "There is one more victim, and that last victim is the same as the enemy. And when you get to know this person, you will have solved this case." Daniel Davis, defense counsel for Ray Bucky, told the jury in his opening statement that, quote, "The truth never really had a chance because children were artificially traumatized by interviewers into falsely believing they were molested." He asked the jury, what is the effect of telling parents that their child has been molested? If the child has not been molested, could you then ever convince the parents thereafter that their child was not molested? Davis told the jury a little bit about his client. Quote, "Ray Bucky is 29. He was born in 1958 in Hawthorne. He attended the Virginia McMartin Preschool. He is an athletic person. You will find he has been active in a number of sports. He attended El Camino College for 2 years. He has coached a variety of sports. When he was at home, he kept a number of pets. He is not a person who could likely harm an animal. They secretly taped conversations between Ray and his mother for hundreds of hours, hoping to hear conversations of crimes. Instead, they talked about animals. He began as a teacher at McMartin Preschool in 1981, took classes at UCLA. He became a teacher in 1981 until he was arrested. He was living with his parents. The house he lived in was searched. Ray Buckey rushed to a hiding location and pulled out some pornography and attempted to flush it down the toilet. It was not child pornography. It was pictures of nude adults. He was caught trying to flush it. Nude adults. And that concluded the opening statements. If there was ever a time to go and get yourself a second drink, now would be it, because we are coming to the prosecution and defense witness testimonies. These were heard before Judge Pounders, which is a great name. We'll take a look at just some of the prosecution witness testimonies, and we'll do that first, which means starting with 2 of the alleged victims. Because of their ages, their names have obviously been concealed. The first, a 12-year-old girl, I'm going to refer to as Rebecca. She gave evidence from the 3rd to the 6th of August, 1987. In her testimony, she talked about the naked movie star game. When asked whether she had to take her clothes off, she confirmed that she did, and that it was Ray who got her to undress. She said that sometimes Ray and Peggy would have their clothes off during the game. She couldn't recall seeing anyone taking pictures during the game, but she remembered seeing the camera lens and hearing it click. She told the court that she was touched intimately by both Ray and Peggy during the game. During her testimony, she stated that Ray had cut up a dead cat, threatening to do the same to their parents if they told anybody. Rebecca accepted that when she first went to CII, she told the interviewer, Sean, that she didn't know anything. When asked why she had kept the abuse quiet, Rebecca said she couldn't even admit it to herself. Rebecca was then cross-examined by Dean Gitz, acting for Peggy Buckey. When he asked whether she had forgotten what had happened at the preschool, Rebecca said that it wasn't until she spoke to Sean at CII that it came back to her. Rebecca accepted that she had friends at her current school, American Martyrs, who also went to CII and who told her about the, quote, yucky secrets. At one point, Dean Gitz said, "You told your parents you didn't remember anything bad happening at the preschool. And when they offered to take you to CII, you said there was no need to because nothing happened." Rebecca said she couldn't remember saying this. Rebecca confirmed that her parents had told her something bad had happened at the school, and she believed it. To clarify things, Dean Gitz asked Rebecca whether it was correct to say that she had a sense that something bad had happened at McMartin, but that she couldn't remember until Sean told her about the naked movie star game. She confirmed this was correct. She couldn't recall Ray threatening children. She couldn't recall testifying at the preliminary hearing that Key told her that Ray had touched children. She couldn't recall testifying at the preliminary hearing that Key told her that Ray forced children to play the game. She denied telling the court at the preliminary hearing that somebody gave the children a pink medicine, saying that she was no longer sure. When asked to name one other child present when they played the naked movie star game, she refused. Dean Gitz asked Rebecca whether Ray was in Miss Lowe's class when she was in her first year at the preschool. She said she couldn't remember. He reminded her that she had testified in the preliminary hearing that Ray had been in Miss Lowe's class. Again, Rebecca said she couldn't remember. Dean Gitz then asked, quote, after your testimony in the preliminary hearing, did anybody tell you maybe Ray wasn't there at the school when you were in Miss Lowe's class? Rebecca said she couldn't remember. Rebecca was then cross-examined by Daniel Davis, representing Ray Buckey. When asked whether there was anything that she hadn't told the court, Rebecca replied, "Not right now." Davis highlighted how Rebecca used "I think" and "kind of" a lot, asking whether that meant she wasn't sure. She confirmed she wasn't. Davis reminded her she had told her dad that it didn't happen to her, but that by the time she spoke to Key, she had strong feelings that Ray had been molesting children. Rebecca agreed. Davis asked Rebecca whether she believed that there were other naked games when she spoke to Sean at the CII, having told Sean about lots of naked games, but only mentioning one during the trial. Rebecca said she couldn't remember. When Davis asked her whether she knew the name of one child who was present when she was touched, Rebecca said no. She couldn't remember the name of any children who were present when she played the naked movie star game either. Davis then said, quote, "At the preliminary hearing, you said the cat was cut 6 months after the naked movie star game was played for the first time. Today, you said it was cut the same day. Is this something you were telling Lael Rubin? Did she tell you that it didn't make sense for you to say 6 months and not be frightened about it, and not to tell your parents? Can you tell me anything that would contribute to the change that you haven't thought about?" To which Rebecca replied, "No." As I said before, Rebecca testified at one point that somebody was giving the children a pink medicine, suggesting the children were being drugged. But when she was asked about this, Rebecca replied, "It was the truth to me at the time." Rebecca confirmed for the court that Sean had told her that 110 children had been interviewed at CII, and that every one of them had said something happened to them at the preschool. She said she didn't think Sean would lie to her. Rebecca seemed inconsistent when talking about the pain she experienced when she was touched by the teachers at the school. At one point, when asked whether it hurt, she said, "Not specifically," and then she said it did. The defense attempted to drill down, which seemed to confuse the young girl. When asked whether the teachers had touched the children's private parts, Rebecca said she didn't know. When asked whether Ray had touched her, she said she didn't know. Judge Pounders asked what positions their body had been in when she was abused, lying face down, sitting, standing, etc. Rebecca said she couldn't remember. Interestingly, Davis referred Rebecca to some tabs in the transcript she had got from Chief Prosecutor Lael. When asked about them, Rebecca said, quote, "They pointed out some things, like a smart answer." When pressed about whether the chief prosecutor had gone over the transcript, telling her how to answer, Rebecca replied, "Sort of." And that ended Rebecca's testimony. The next prosecution witness we're going to talk about is an 11-year-old boy who I think is the brother of Rebecca. I'm going to call him Sam. The prosecution initially asked Sam about the alleged animal abuse he witnessed. He confirmed he had seen Ray kill a horse with a bat. When asked whether he had gone over questions with the chief prosecutor, Sam confirmed he had. He also confirmed they had practiced answers and the names of the teachers. Sam was asked whether he had forgotten about the molestation. He said he forgot everything until Lael Rubin and Key McFarlane helped him remember. Sam confirmed that his mother told him he was molested at the preschool, along with other children, and he believed her. When asked whether he could recall what Ray did with his hands, Sam confirmed he was touched, but couldn't describe how. He told the court he didn't remember any hand touching his penis. Sam was asked whether during his interview at CII he had guessed the answers. He was unsure. At one time during the interview, Key McFarlane had asked him about the tickle game, to which Sam had responded then that Ray didn't touch him. Sam couldn't recall this in court. Daniel Davis read directly from the transcript. Key: Was the game some sort of tricky game? Sam: I don't think Ray did anything. Key: Other kids? Sam: I never saw that. Ray never touched me. Key: We know the sneaky game. Can you show me the sneaky place? Sam: Maybe in Weena. Key: How well you remember. You have done a real good job. The exchange between Key McFarlane and Sam continued. Key: Did anybody put anything yucky in your mouth? To which Sam didn't respond. Key: Can you remember? Sam: I'm not sure. Key: How about a finger in your hole? Sam: Yes. Key: We'll see how smart you are. Did anything come out of Ray's wiener? Sam didn't respond. Key: What did the stuff taste like? Sam: He never did that. The next prosecution witness we're going to talk about is the mother of two McMartin students. We're going to refer to her as Debbie. Debbie testified about some unusual behaviours her daughter had been exhibiting, which included nightmares, bladder infections, and dancing scantily clad, which Debbie and her husband had discouraged. When she was cross-examined by Dean Gitz, he asked her about the reputation of McMartin when she initially took her children there. She said the school's reputation was excellent. When asked whether she had noticed anything improper at the school, Debbie said she wondered why a 20-year-old male was working there. Regarding Debbie's son, she had confirmed that he was always taken to a doctor for regular checkups. Dean Gitz asked her whether everything was okay with her son, according to the doctor. She confirmed that he was fine. When asked whether her daughter had ever said anything bad about the teachers, Debbie said she couldn't remember. She said that after her friend received the letter from police, she thought it was definitely possible that Ray Buckey touched the children. She said she spoke to her children about it, but their responses were negative. On this basis, she was satisfied nothing happened. Her daughter never told her that any kids were being molested or that they were being made to play naked games. Debbie told the court that she believed that CII did have the power to determine whether the children had been molested. Debbie confirmed that it was Key who told her that her daughter had been molested. This was enough to convince Debbie. Debbie confessed that she and some other parents had had a party to celebrate the arrests of Ray and Peggy Buckey. When she was cross-examined by Daniel Davis, Debbie confirmed that there was nothing to suggest sexual abuse prior to the receipt of the letter. When asked whether there was anything out of the ordinary at the preschool, Debbie repeated that it seemed strange that a man of Ray's age would want to be working with children. Davis asked the mother whether her belief in the molestation was based solely on things she had heard. She replied this was not the case, that it was based on what her children had told her. Is it just me, or does almost every criminal case involve a jailhouse informant? Well, this case is no exception. Introducing prosecution witness George Freeman. When examined by Chief Prosecutor Lael Rubin, George Freeman told the court that he had been convicted of 5 felonies and was currently on parole. He also told the court that he had recently been arrested on the 10th of November 1987. He confirmed that he had not been offered any incentives in return for his testimony. When asked whether Ray Buckey had made any admissions regarding molestation, George Freeman said that he had said it happened during nap time and that he used KY jelly and baby oil. George Freeman was asked why he himself had admitted to molesting children. Freeman explained it was to make Ray Buckey feel more comfortable, and he was curious. Rubin asked him, "What did he tell you?" Freeman told the court that Ray Buckey admitted to raping a male child. He also said that Ray Buckey had taken photographs and films depicting children performing sex acts to South Dakota and Denmark. When asked whether Ray Buckey had admitted to hurting animals, Freeman confirmed he had threatened to slaughter a cow if the kids told on him. Freeman was then asked how he came to know Sergeant Dvorak. Freeman recalled that they met in another case from 1983. Sergeant Dvorak helped Freeman out by talking to the judge in that case. Instead of getting 3 years, Freeman got 1 year in the county jail. Freeman told the court that on the 28th of March, a sheriff took him to see Daniel Davis and Ray Buckey. When asked what was said, Freeman replied, quote, "He said the Aryan Brotherhood want my ass, and 2 Mexicans in San Fernando and the BGF in Soledad wanting to get me. And he said he would put me on TV and the newspapers where everybody could see what I look like. He told me to get my ass out of Ray Buckey's room. He said there would be 2 men waiting for me on the day of my release." When asked whether it was suggested he move out of LA, Freeman said this was true and that he received assistance from Mr. Gil Brunetti of the District Attorney's Office, who paid for his first month's rent, which amounted to approximately $1,000. Freeman was then cross-examined by Daniel Davis, who was quite aggressive with his questioning. Davis asked Freeman up front whether he was a rat, to which Freeman coolly replied, "They say I am in different places." When asked how anybody would know how many lies he told in the preliminary hearing, Freeman replied, "Only God." Davis reminded Freeman of a case where he lied in front of the jury. Freeman confirmed that he lied about one thing, but that he had his reasons. Davis then said, quote, "I'm going to list cases in which you committed perjury. Is there any case in which you didn't perjure yourself?" Freeman was unsure. Davis then said, "The DA, Watts, used you as a witness after he knew you lied." Freeman confirmed this was true. In the perjury case, Freeman had stood up, saying that the defendant had made a confession, very similar to what he was doing now. Davis went on, quote, "You said you had only 5 felony convictions. Isn't it true that you've had 9 felony convictions?" Freeman confessed, "Yeah, maybe, the way you calculate it." Davis asked Freeman whether he had ever said that a man committed murder when he hadn't. Freeman referred to a case from Soledad. He said, "I didn't see him stab anybody." When asked, Freeman confirmed that he had initially had concerns about appearing in newspapers and on television discussing the McMartin case. However, that all seemed to change because 2 days after he got out of the county jail, he called Channel 7 Eyewitness News to arrange an interview, despite there being a gag order preventing anyone from discussing the case with the media. Finally, when Freeman expressed concern about the safety of his sister and mother, Davis raised Freeman's 1983 robbery and burglary case where he tied up his mother and sister. And that ended George Freeman's testimony. The next prosecution witness we're going to look at is Dr. Bruce Woodling, the Director of Medical Examinations for Ventura County. Dr. Woodling was paid for his work in the case through district attorney funds to the tune of $2,500 a day. The rate of compensation he received was $250 per examination. This covered the cost of conducting the examinations, meeting with Dr. Hager and Key McFarlane, discussing the papers and preparing the reports. In court, he was asked whether he had seen children who had been molested but who had no physical symptoms. The doctor confirmed that he had seen cases where there were no physical findings. The doctor was then asked whether he had, without physical finding, stated under oath that a child was, in his opinion, molested. Dr. Woodling responded, quote, "I'm certain that in cases where there were no findings of molestation, what I have testified to in the past is that the lack of a physical finding does not preclude that the child was in fact either sodomized, fondled, or involved in an act of vulvar coitus." Dr. Woodling was then asked whether he had, in a court of law, testified that a child wasn't molested. He replied that he didn't believe he had ever testified about children being molested, preferring to talk about trauma consistent with digital manipulation, penile genital contact, an act of sodomy, etc. He stated that the fact that a physical injury is not present doesn't preclude that a certain act may not have occurred. Counsel then asked Dr. Woodling whether he had found any evidence on Rebecca consistent with sodomy by a penis, to which the doctor said that he had not found any trauma to her perianal area whatsoever, but that this did not preclude a finger or other object having been used. The following question was then put to Dr. Woodling. Is it possible that a leading question might produce a false answer from a child? The doctor stated that a leading question might produce a directed answer, but that he had never personally been involved in any case where interviewers influenced children to say that they were molested when they were not. Dr. Woodling was asked whether his belief that children don't lie about molestation could have influenced his opinions. He didn't agree with this. He explained that he believed that when children are being asked about molestation and they say nothing happened, it can sometimes be because they have difficulty talking about the issue. Counsel then posed a scenario to the doctor, quote, "Let's take the child who says he hasn't been molested, and then 3 or 4 months later, he says he was raped and sodomized. Can both of these statements be truthful?" Dr. Woodling responded by saying that in his experience, children don't give false reports, but that there are many children who struggle with making a disclosure. Dr. Woodling went on to say that he had never been involved in a case where the interviewers had influenced children to say that they were molested when they weren't. Dr. Woodling was asked whether he would have any concern about the reliability of a child if they changed the facts of their allegations. The doctor said no. Counsel asked the doctor about false allegations, quote, "By your definition, would that include a situation where a child might say that he or she was sodomized and then later say it didn't happen? Is that a false report by your definition?" The doctor agreed that would constitute a false report. He went on to explain that he knew of children retracting allegations, but that it was part of the process of understanding the psychological dynamic of making disclosures. When asked whether his medical findings corroborated sodomy, Dr. Woodling confirmed there was no evidence of scarring, but that in itself did not mean that sodomy did not occur, only that no scarring occurred from sodomy. Finally, counsel asked, quote, "Could a doctor then say, looking at the anus of Rebecca, it is consistent with no molestation?" Dr. Woodling confirmed that it would be consistent with molestation with no trauma or no molestation at all. Our final and perhaps most interesting prosecution witness is the main lady herself, Kee McFarlane. When explaining her job, McFarlane told the court that she was the director of a program at CII, which focused on the sexual abuse of children. Now, before we get into her testimony, I've mentioned a few times about the criticisms surrounding the interviews that the children had at CII. So that you get an understanding of the issues the defense had with these interviews, I'm going to read an extract from a transcript of a taped interview that Kee McFarlane had with an 8-year-old boy. I think you're going to find it quite interesting. To be clear, there are puppets and dolls used during these interviews, which is why there's talk of Mr. Monkey and Mr. Alligator. It's not because I've lost my mind. McFarlane: "Mr. Monkey is a little bit chicken, and he can't remember any of the naked games, but we think that you can, because we know a naked game that you were around for, because the other kids told us, and it's called Naked Movie Star. Do you remember that game, Mr. Alligator, or is your memory too bad?" Boy: I don't remember that game." McFarlane: "Oh, Mr. Alligator." Boy: Well, it's a little song that me and a friend heard of." McFarlane: "Oh." Boy: "Well, I heard out loud someone singing, 'Naked Movie Star, Naked Movie Star.'" McFarlane: "You know what, Mr. Alligator? That means you're smart, because that's the same song the other kids knew, and that's how we really know you're smarter than you look, so you better not play dumb, Mr. Alligator." Boy: "Well, I didn't really hear a whole lot. I just heard someone yell it from out in the... Someone yelled it." McFarlane: "Maybe, Mr. Alligator, you peeked in the window one day and saw them playing it, and maybe you could remember and help us." Boy: "Well, no, I haven't seen anyone playing Naked Movie Star. I've only heard the song." McFarlane: "What good are you? You must be dumb." Boy: Well, I don't know really. Remember seeing anyone play that because I wasn't there when people are playing it. McFarlane: You weren't? You weren't? That's why we're hoping maybe you saw. See, a lot of these puppets weren't there, but they got to see what happened. Boy: Well, I saw a lot of fighting. McFarlane: I bet you can help us a lot though, because, like, Naked Movie Star is a simple game, because we know about the game, because we just had 20 kids tell us about the game. Just this morning, a little girl came in and played it for us and sang it just like that. Do you think if I asked you a question, you could put your thinking cap on and you might remember Mr. Alligator? Boy: Maybe. McFarlane: You could nod your head yes or no. Can you remember who took the pictures for the Naked Movie Star game? That would be a great thing to feed into the secret machine, the video camera. And then it would be all gone, just like all the other kids did. You can just nod whether you remember or not. See how good your memory is. The boy nods the puppet's head. McFarlane: You do? Well, that's remarkable. I wonder if you could hold a pointer in your mouth and then you wouldn't have to say a word and you could just point. Boy: Places pretend camera on adult male nude doll using alligator puppet. Sometimes he did. McFarlane: Can I pat you on the head for that? Look what a big help you can be. You're going to help all these little children because you're so smart. Okay, did they ever pose in funny poses for the pictures? Boy: Well, it wasn't a real camera. We just played. McFarlane: Mr. Alligator, I'm going to ask you something here. Now, we already found out from the other kids that it was a real camera, so you don't have to pretend, okay? Is that a deal? Boy: Yes, it was a play camera that we played with. McFarlane: Oh, and it went flash? Boy: Well, it didn't exactly go flash. McFarlane: It didn't exactly go flash. Went click? Did little pictures go zip, come out of it? Boy: I don't remember that. McFarlane: Oh, you don't remember that? Well, you're doing pretty good, Mr. Alligator. I got to shake your hand. Yeah, I know. Back in the courtroom, McFarlane's time on the witness stand was long, and it's pretty unsurprising when you look at just that extract alone. During her testimony, she was cross-examined by Dean Gitz, who often pulled extracts from transcripts like the one you just heard. At one point, McFarlane agreed that by saying things like, I know them because other kids told me, and every kid from the preschool came in and told, during interviews, she was putting pressure on the children to remember games they might not have otherwise remembered. As we know, McFarlane relied on the use of puppets and dolls. Gitz questioned her whether the use of anatomically correct dolls suggested naked games and naked people. But McFarlane didn't think this was the case. Quote, all the mummies and dads now know what happened at the school, all the touching, all those sneaky little games. Gitz asked McFarlane whether this statement and the use of authority figures as sources of knowledge would put pressure on a child. McFarlane suggested that this was a tactic to reassure the child. Well, I'm glad you're not so dumb, Mr. Snake. Do you think by telling the interviewed girl that you are telling her she's dumb if she didn't agree with you? McFarlane responded negatively. Another quote from the tapes. Well, Mr. Snake, you and any puppets you want to use can help us figure it out so no more kids will have yucky stuff happen to them. Gitz goes on. Do you think this is one of the most fundamental pressure points? All the other kids said it happened. Isn't that telling the girl that kids are getting raped and molested? Secret police are watching Ray all the time. Don't you think that statement might influence the girl to believe that Ray is a bad person? McFarlane agreed, yes. At another point during the interviews, McFarlane said to a child, quote, I think we should beat up Mr. Ray. What a bad guy. Don't you think he's a bad guy? He's not going to do this any more to kids, is he? Gitz asked whether she then encouraged the young girl to beat up the doll, representing Ray Bucky. McFarlane replied, in a manner of speaking, yes. Gitz questioned whether Ray Bucky even stood a chance. Key McFarlane responded, the issue of fair may have to be left to the courts to decide. Key McFarlane was then cross-examined by Ray Bucky's defense counsel, Daniel Davis. He asked McFarlane whether showing a naked doll with an erect penis might suggest things to a child. McFarlane explained that they had tried to design the dolls in such a way that the penis would not seem stimulated. She also said that there was no research that suggested naked dolls caused children to provide incorrect or false information. Davis asked whether she saw anything wrong in telling a child what the other children had said during their interviews. She saw how there could be issues legally, but denied that it was harmful, saying that she only did it to prevent children from clamming up. Davis questioned whether by telling the children what others had said, she might be creating a realm of fantasy in which children might make false accusations in which they believe they're just pretending. Key McFarlane replied, quote, "No, it's a major issue because there's not any data to show that has ever happened, but because it is consistently raised, all of the studies with the use of anatomical dolls have shown that the use of those dolls does not in any way lead to the false reports about abuse, and there are now, because of this case and the many other cases in which these issues have been repeatedly raised in court, we now have research that looks into issues of suggestibility. There are 5 or 6 articles which address these exact issues which you are raising, and they are debunking the idea that by suggesting to children, even leading and misleading questions suggestive of child sexual abuse, they are debunking the idea that children just pick up and just repeat it. It's information that I didn't have when I did these interviews. Now, 5 years later, the research is out there. Numerous studies, and the resistance of children to these questions is in the 93 to 99 percentile. There is now research on the subject. McFarlane was forced to admit that no children initiated violence against any of the dolls of their own volition. Davis asserted that McFarlane's technique during her interviews was to take perfectly innocent games and convert them into criminal accusations by inserting words like naked and calling them yucky. McFarlane, of course, denied this. One of Mr. Davis's final questions riled Key McFarlane. He implied that she was trying to get a young boy to demonstrate sodomy with the dolls so that she could show it to his parents. McFarlane expressed shock at this suggestion. She said she wanted the parents to see things for themselves as they knew their children better than she did, and so they could know in their own minds whether something happened to their children. Now, you may or may not be happy to hear that we are now done with the prosecution witnesses. I'm sorry that was so long, but I think it was really important to show you the issues the defense had with those interviews and to really look at Key McFarlane's interviewing techniques, because we all know that children are quite gullible and can be easily misled. We're now going to kick off the defense witnesses with Dr. Michael Maloney. Dr. Maloney was questioned initially by defense attorney Dean Gitz. Dr. Maloney was tasked with watching a few of the taped interviews in their entirety prior to his testimony. In court, he was very critical of the interview techniques adopted. He said that the interviews were incorrectly led by the interviewers and not the children, meaning the children were not the focus of the interviews. He criticised the excessive talking of the interviewers, given that the children themselves seemed willing to talk. He referred to the approach interviewers took as stage setting. He reminded the court that the interviewer's job is to just facilitate and get the child to talk. According to Dr. Maloney, the problem with interviewers talking more than the children is that the children learn that their job in the process is to just sit back and follow the interviewer's lead. This can contaminate the interview as it doesn't flow in the direction of the child. Dr. Maloney explained that all the children were machined through the exact same process at CII, and that by the end of the interview, when they were being asked questions about sexual behavior, he noted that they became fairly non-verbal, they were passive, and sometimes were questioning in tone. Dr. Maloney at one point during his testimony used the term script. When asked why he used that term, Maloney replied, quote, "The reason I called it a script is that in interviewing children, the focus is on the child. The opposite of following the child is following some kind of predetermined program. I used the word script for that, to refer to that program, but I also used the word script because even word usage by the various examiners with the various children was very close. It was as if they were reading a script. Dr. Maloney then broke down the interviews to show how they were scripted. He said the interviews almost always started with the child drawing a picture. After that, the interviewer and the child would name body parts, the focus being on sexual body parts. Then the anatomically correct dolls were introduced, again with the focus being on the sexual body parts. Next, the interviewers would show the children photos of students and teachers from McMartin. The individuals in the photos were identified by the interviewer with specific focus on certain teachers in the school. Puppets were then introduced. The interviewer used them to find out more about the games. Ray Bucky was then discussed, and interviewers would tell the children that he was being surveilled by police. Ejaculation was then raised by the interviewer, who encouraged the children to talk about what it might look and taste like. Dr. Maloney accepted that the tapes didn't show the children or the interviewer walking into the room, during which time something could have happened, further explanation, etc. The act of identifying the sexual body parts was criticised because, although it might seem appropriate in a case like this, it's setting the stage that they are going to be talking about sexual matters. This is made worse by the fact the dolls were already unclothed when they were introduced to the child, bringing the focus again to sex. The use of photographs showing pictures of students and teachers also posed problems. According to Dr. Maloney, the interviewer's responses to the children pointing to a particular picture, such as "yeah" and "that's what a lot of kids told us," acts as reinforcement. This increases the probability that the child would choose that picture again later in the conversation. Another issue Dr. Maloney had was, as he referred to it, older kids, younger kids. When asked, the doctor explained to the court that this was an inducement to get the children to talk. They were made to feel that they, as older children, needed to talk because the younger children couldn't. They would be better detectives because they were smarter, and by talking, they would be helping the younger children. Dr. Maloney described this as an external pressure. He referred to the next issue as the secret policeman. This is fairly self-explanatory. Interviewers told the children that Ray Bucky was being surveilled by police, which identifies him as a bad person. The next issue Dr. Maloney identified is referred to as names introduced, where the interviewer refers to possibly innocent games as sneaky, tricky, or naked. Dr. Maloney called this an information-giving technique. Dr. Maloney also criticised the interviewer's direct questions about Ray ejaculating and the subsequent implication of oral sex. Dr. Maloney told the court that he couldn't recall any child bringing this up before the interviewers raised it. Dr. Maloney concluded by saying that these interviews were very inappropriate due to the many things wrong and the significant amount of negative influence imposed. In summary, he said, it presents information to the children that we don't know if they had or did not have before. Our next defense witness is Charles Bucky, father of Ray and husband of Peggy. Dean Gitz asked the witness when it was that he found out his son Ray didn't like to wear underwear. He replied that it was around the time Ray left high school, so 2 or 3 years before he started working at McMartin. Prosecutor Roger Gunson asked Charles whether he and Mrs. Bucky had had a conversation to discuss whether it be appropriate for Ray to work at the preschool. He confirmed that they did. Gunson asked Charles whether they had also discussed the explicit material owned by Mr. Bucky when determining whether he would be an appropriate addition to the preschool. Charles said they had not discussed it. Gunson then asked whether Charles and Peggy discussed the appropriateness of Ray working at the preschool when they knew he didn't wear underpants. Charles confirmed that this had been discussed. He said that he did not approve, but he also didn't disapprove. Charles denied ever having been told by Peggy that Ray had exposed himself at the preschool or in front of a girls' soccer team. He also denied ever having heard of a complaint about someone seeing Ray Bucky's genitals in a private setting. When asked by Daniel Davis whether he instructed his son to wear underwear, Charles said he did not. Now, if you're wondering like I did how Charles knew his son didn't wear underwear, he was asked in court, and his response was that it became a topic of conversation in which Ray and some of his friends admitted they didn't like wearing underwear. Under re-cross-examination by Gunson, Charles was asked whether he had any concerns about the children sitting on Ray Bucky's lap, knowing he wasn't wearing underwear. Charles replied, quote, "Not my concern." Gunson asked Charles whether he had any concerns that preschoolers might see Ray's genitals because he wore shorts without any underwear. Charles said that this never entered his mind. When asked whether he had considered the possible effects upon the children if they had seen the genitals of Ray Bucky, Charles replied no. Charles was asked whether he had ever walked into his son's bedroom and saw him lying without clothing on, and whether he had seen him lying with pornographic pictures around him. Charles replied no to both questions. Our next defense witness is Betty Rader, a former co-defendant of Peggy and Ray Bucky. Dean Gitz asked Rader the following questions. Did you ever see Peggy Bucky naked? Did you ever see naked children? Did you ever see Ray Bucky naked? The witness replied no to every question. Under cross-examination by prosecutor Lael Rubin, she asked whether it was true that she had, on several occasions, told a mother at the school that she didn't like to leave Ray Bucky alone with the children. Rader denied this. When asked whether she had told a parent that Ray Bucky was not a qualified teacher, Rader replied, "That's different from behaving improperly." Having been asked to answer the question, she confirmed this was true. When asked why she said that, Betty Rader replied that she said it because of his lack of experience, but that this was just her opinion. Our next witness is Ray Bucky's mother and co-defendant Peggy Bucky, represented by defense attorney Dean Gitz. You'll notice that Peggy gives very short answers, so I apologize for the repetition. Firstly, Gitz asked Peggy whether she had molested any of the children or touched them on any part of their bodies for the purpose of sexual gratification of either herself or anybody else. She replied never to these questions. She denied ever having been naked in front of the children and denied ever having made any of the children get naked. She denied ever having transported the children off school grounds for the purpose of molesting them and denied ever threatening the children. Gitz asked Peggy whether she had ever seen anyone molest the children while she was at the preschool. She replied, never. She also said she had never seen the children naked with any other member of the staff at the preschool. Gitz asked whether anything at the preschool had given Peggy the slightest suspicion that any of the children were being molested in any manner. She said never. She denied ever having conspired with anyone to molest any children at the preschool. Peggy was asked why she hired her son Raymond as an aide at the preschool. She replied, quote, "He was my son, and he was interested in working with children, and I felt he had the potential of being a good teacher." Peggy informed the court that Betty Rader had been assigned to be present with Ray in the afternoons. She was asked when she first became aware that she was a suspect. She said she didn't find out until she was arrested. She confirmed for the court that she was arrested on the 22nd of March, 1984. When cross-examined by prosecutor Lael Rubin, Peggy was asked what had caused her to believe her son Ray had an interest in working with children. She explained that her son had a gentle, loving way with children, and that it was when they were out to lunch that he told her how he enjoyed working with children and that he wanted to come and work at the preschool. Peggy told the court that her son had begun working at the school and had started some teaching courses at El Camino College. The prosecution's line of questioning returned to Ray Bucky's decision not to wear underwear. Peggy was largely unflustered by these questions, as she had been throughout her testimony. At one point, the prosecution asked Peggy whether Ray's not wearing underwear might make it easier for a child to touch his genitals. She replied no. Similarly, when she was asked whether Ray's not wearing underwear might make it easier for him to get aroused if a child sat on his lap, she again replied no. Rubin then asked Peggy, quote, "Are you aware that a girl grabbed your son on his penis, or had you heard that she grabbed your son on his penis?" Peggy replied that she was aware of this, but had not observed it herself. It was Ray who told her that the girl grabbed his genitals through his clothes. Following which, he told her that she shouldn't do that. Peggy confirmed that Ray was sitting when this occurred, but did not know whether the girl had been sitting on his lap. Rubin asked the following questions, quote, "When you checked that one time, you saw he did have a hard-on, correct?" Peggy exclaimed, "He certainly did not." Rubin asked a follow-up question, quote, "Would you agree it's an unusual event when the director of a preschool checks her son for an erection?" Peggy told the court that she did it one time only. She called the prosecutor's question dumb, saying it had to do with Ray being male. I can't wrap my head around why Ray being male means his mum is entitled to check his genitals for an erection. Even if it was once or 50 times, that's weird. But anyway, it's true, Mrs. Bucky, that as time went on, there were more and more complaints about your son, Raymond Bucky, correct? Prosecutor Rubin asked. No, Peggy replied. When Peggy had initially spoken to Detective Hogue, it was said that Peggy told Detective Hogue that the concerned parent should have come to her first before going to the police. When this was put to Peggy in court, she said that she couldn't remember saying that. When pressed, she said, quote, "No, I think that's up to the parents to make that decision. I've said that I think it would be nice if they would come to me, but that was up to the parents to do what they thought was the right thing. It's not for me to tell them what to do." Finally, Prosecutor Rubin asked Peggy whether during the search of her property, she said, quote, "You can't believe little kids, they'll lie." Peggy said she could not recall saying that. Rubin followed this up by saying, quote, "Mrs. Bucky, if Detective Hogue put that in her police report, would that be untrue?" To which Peggy replied, quote, "It certainly should be. She lied about a lot of things." Now we come to the individual at the center of this whole case, Ray Bucky, represented by his defense attorney, Daniel Davis. Let's just jump straight in with this one. Ray was asked by Davis whether during his time at the McMartin preschool, he had ever reached an agreement of any kind with other teachers to conceal children being molested at the preschool. Ray replied, no. Ray then answered no to the following questions. Firstly, whether he had ever seen his mother Peggy naked at the preschool, if he had ever been inside St. Cross Church, if he had ever touched a child to arouse or obtain sexual gratification, if he had ever knowingly exposed his genitals to a child, if he had ever hurt said child, whether he had ever molested said child in any way, whether he had ever sodomized a child, whether he had ever sodomized anybody, whether he had ever been a member of any type of network of child molesters or involved in the sale or production of kiddie porn, whether he had ever seen kiddie porn, and finally, whether he had ever killed a horse with a baseball bat. Davis then asked Ray whether George Freeman, the jailhouse informant, ever spoke to him about sex. Ray replied, quote, his sex. He told me about his ex-wives. He told me about the women he had sex with and the men he had sex with. Ray Bucky was then cross-examined by Lael Rubin. She asked the defendant a series of questions about a woman, Barbara Goals. Authorities wanted to show that Bucky didn't have normal sexual relations with women. They believed that this would support their assertion he was a paedophile. They therefore tracked down a woman from Montana, Barbara, who claimed to have met Bucky and tried to flirt with him. She told authorities that he wasn't interested. However, when Barbara was called as a defense witness, she said that she had originally lied to investigators to protect her reputation. It transpired that when she met Ray Bucky, Barbara was engaged to be married, so she lied, but in all actuality she did have sex with Ray Bucky. Rubin asked Ray whether he had ever had sex with Barbara. He confirmed he did. The prosecution asked Ray why Barbara would have said initially that they didn't have sex. Ray told the court that Barbara had her reasons. Ray also told the court that his mother wasn't happy about his relationship with Barbara. In fact, the whole family didn't approve of the relationship. Rubin asked Ray whether he had belief that child molesters didn't have relationships with adult females. Ray replied, quote, "It's common sense. If you have a perversion for children, you wouldn't have a desire for female adults." Rubin then asked Ray whether he was speaking from experience. Ray denied ever having had a sexual desire for children, never had and never would. On the 2nd of November 1989, after a staggering 30 months of testimony, the jury was left to deliberate. The jury spent a further 2.5 months deliberating its verdict. And then the verdict came. On 52 of the 65 charges against Peggy and Ray Buckey, including all of the charges against Peggy, the jury returned an acquittal. On the 13 remaining charges against Ray Buckey, the jury was deadlocked. When talking about the verdict, the jury foreperson, Louis Change, was critical of the interview tapes, calling them too biased and too leading. Another jurist said, quote, "Whether I believe he did it and whether it was proven are very different." Judge Pounders offered his own comments on the verdict, saying that he was not surprised at all. The verdict caused outrage in the community, leading to a 500-strong protest through the streets of Manhattan Beach. A television poll showed 87% of respondents thought that the Buckeys were guilty, despite the verdict. There was an immediate demand for a retrial. Parents and child protection groups wanted prosecutors to retry Ray Buckey on the deadlocked charges. Because of increasing pressure, District Attorney Ira Rayner signed off on the retrial. He also assigned 2 new prosecutors to the case, Joe Martinez and Pamela Ferrero. Daniel Davis, defense attorney for Ray Buckey, applied to have Judge Pounders removed from the case in favor of a new judge, Superior Court Judge Stanley Weisberg. Davis's application was successful, and Judge Pounders himself even expressed relief, saying, quote, "I'm finally free after 3 years and 3 months. I was honestly afraid I couldn't live through it." The prosecution's case in the second trial, you'll be happy to hear, only lasted 13 days as opposed to 15 months. The whole trial lasted 3 months and involved 8 counts of molestation against 3 children who were amongst the 11 witnesses who testified. Someone who wasn't called as a prosecution witness was CII's Key McFarlane. Instead, she was called as a defense witness. At the end of the 3 months, the jury were left to deliberate. The deliberations were described by one juror as excruciating. The case again ended with a deadlock on all 8 counts. The jury indicated that they were leaning towards acquittal on 6 counts and convictions on 1 count, but couldn't reach a decision. Following the second trial, DA Reiner reported that the prosecution would not be trying Ray Buckey a 3rd time, and that all the charges against him were therefore dismissed. These trials were costly in so many ways. Altogether, the state spent $15 million. Ray Buckey spent 5 years in jail before he was released on bail. There was the loss of homes, jobs, and life savings. And with the jury deadlocked, there would still be people in the community who believed Ray Buckey was guilty because he hadn't been found innocent. Perhaps the saddest part of this whole case is the impact it would have on all the children who were involved. Some were subject to intimate examinations, whilst others had to stand up in court and testify in front of a room of strange faces, answering very personal and embarrassing questions. When speaking to CBS, Ray said, quote, "Those poor children went through hell, but I'm not the cause of their hell, and neither is my mother. The cause of their hell is the adults who took this case and made it what it was." The parents also suffered through this case, having to hear from experts that their children were subjected to sexual abuse at the hands of daycare providers. This was never proven, but there will be parents who believe their children wholeheartedly and who felt let down by the criminal justice system. This case had ramifications that reached further than just the immediate people involved. It was said that across the country, daycare providers were changing how they dealt with children in their care, reluctant to comfort or touch the children out of fear of what happened at McMartin Preschool. An outcome which is particularly sad was that many daycare providers were forced to close because they couldn't afford the liability insurance rates, which had skyrocketed in response to the McMartin case. After the trial, the Buckys and Virginia successfully sued a McMartin parent for slander in 1991, but they only received damages of $1 million. When the case finished, the LA Times interviewed Peggy Bucky. They described her as bitter, as she recalled all she had lost because of the McMartin case. In 1990, after the case against Ray was dropped, she said how they'd lost everything. Peggy Bucky died in 2000 at the age of 74 after paramedics found her unconscious in the home where she lived before and after the trial. Virginia McMartin had died 5 years earlier. They were survived by Charles Bucky, Ray Bucky, who after the trial attended law school, and Peggy Ann Bucky, who resumed her teaching career. To conclude this case, Daniel Davis, Ray Bucky's attorney, told the LA Times that it was Peggy Bucky who lost the most from this case. Quote, "Peggy was spiritual, and she never seemed concerned specifically about what would happen if they were convicted, but she lost everything. Now that she has passed away, I would say that's one we should be ashamed of." And that is the rather depressing end to today's episode on the McMartin preschool abuse case. Thank you so much for joining me. I hope you enjoyed it. The Student's Verdict is a bi-weekly podcast, so follow us on social media to hear about our next episode. The Student's Verdict can be found on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, Podbean, Spreaker, and Google Play. And while you're there, why not check out Podcast from the Crypt? I'll see you on the next one, and remember to keep living the dream.